The alkali flat smelled like salt and old metal and something else, something I had no name for yet. I had been standing in front of the thing for 11 minutes before I pulled out my flashlight, not because I needed time to work up the nerve, because I was counting the stress fractures in the hull from 30 feet away, and I wanted a full picture before I got close enough for it to become personal. It was about the size of a commercial warehouse, teardrop-shaped if the teardrop had been dropped from a very significant height and had opinions about the landing. The front end was buried 4 feet into the desert floor. The back end listed 20 degrees to the left. Every external panel I could see from this angle had the kind of warping that comes from extreme deceleration in atmosphere. Not an explosion, not a weapon, just physics applied too fast. The government team had been here for 9 days before me. They had set up lights, a perimeter, a command tent with good coffee, and then, one by one, they had found reasons to be somewhere else. The official contractor walked out on day 7. He left a written note that said the project exceeded his scope of expertise. I found the note in the command tent next to a half-eaten granola bar and a coffee mug that still had warmth in it. Day 8, the 2 structural engineers from Nevada filed a joint report that used the phrase beyond salvageable 12 times in 4 pages. Day 9, the senior government liaison, a man named Craig Duffin who wore ties in the desert and seemed genuinely offended by the inconvenience of everything, called Washington and said the asset was a loss. Day 10, they called me. My name is Marcus Reyes. I have a truck that runs on stubbornness and a shop in Henderson that fixes things other people walk away from. Cars, mostly. Industrial equipment sometimes. Once, a vintage aircraft engine that 3 certified mechanics had already declared dead. I got it running in a week. I charged accordingly. Craig met me at the perimeter with a clipboard, and the expression of a man who had already decided this was a waste of time. You understand, he said, that every qualified specialist we brought in assessed this as non-functional, irreparable, condemned by its own onboard systems. What did the onboard system say exactly? He checked the clipboard. Vessel condemned. Return protocol initiated. I looked at the ship. It had not moved. It had not returned anywhere. Return protocol doesn't seem to be working, I said. No. So it's just sitting here calling itself condemned and not doing anything about it. That is correct. I picked up my toolbox. I'll take a look. He followed me for about 40 feet before he stopped. I kept walking. The closer I got, the more the damage told me. Hull stress fractures running diagonally across the forward section, which meant the structural load had shifted mid-flight before impact. Secondary exhaust ports on the underside were blown outward rather than inward, which meant a pressure event in the propulsion system, not an external strike. The landing gear, if that's what the 4 retracted prongs under the belly were, had never deployed. Either it happened too fast, or the system never got the signal. I had seen this before, not a spaceship. A semi-truck on I-15 outside of Barstow, driver walked away without a scratch, truck looked like a compressed aluminum can. Every system had failed in sequence. One thing knocked out the next, chain reaction all the way down. I circled the hull once, then twice. On the second pass I found the secondary access panel on the port side, about 8 feet up, half melted at the edges from re-entry heat but structurally intact. The locking mechanism was visible through the warped edge, rotational, concentric rings, 3 of them, each one needing to turn in sequence. I stared at it for a while. It was a jar lid. An extraordinarily sophisticated, alien-manufactured, heat-resistant jar lid. But the principle was identical. Apply rotational torque in sequence, counterclockwise on the outer ring, then the middle, then the inner. I could see the wear patterns that indicated direction. I went back to my truck. Craig was standing next to it, checking his phone. I need a ladder and my half-inch drive torque wrench, I said. The long one. It's in the bed under the tarp. He stared at me. You've been out there 4 minutes. I found the door. He looked toward the ship, back at me. The entire team spent 9 days and did not find a point of entry. They were probably looking for a button, I said, or a panel that lights up, something that looked like a door. And you found one. It looks like a jar lid. Hand me the wrench. He handed me the wrench. He did not look convinced. He looked like a man watching someone do something that was either going to be very impressive or very embarrassing, and he had already placed his bet. I set up the ladder. I applied the torque wrench to the outer ring. It resisted. I applied more torque. It resisted more. I repositioned my grip, got my whole shoulder into it, and the outer ring moved. 1/4 turn. The middle ring next. Stiffer. The heat damage had warped the tolerance slightly, and I had to work the wrench back and forth 3 times before it broke free and completed its rotation. The inner ring turned almost easily once the other two had moved, like it had been waiting. The panel swung inward on a hinge I hadn't seen. I stood on the ladder at the threshold of an alien spacecraft and looked inside. Dark, completely dark, I switched on my flashlight. The interior was larger than the exterior suggested, which I filed away as a problem for a physicist. The walls curved inward toward a central corridor that ran lengthwise through the ship. Everything was the same material. Smooth, dark, with a faint surface texture like brushed graphite. No visible seams. No right angles anywhere. Every junction was curved. I stepped inside. The floor held my weight. I stood there and moved the flashlight in a slow arc. Workstations along the walls, 6 of them, each with a surface that had gone completely dark. A central column running floor to ceiling that I guessed was either structural or the power distribution hub. Conduit runs visible along the ceiling, most of them intact, 2 of them ruptured at a junction point near the back. I walked to the ruptured conduits and looked at them. Ruptured outward. Same as the exhaust ports. Internal pressure event. Something had spiked hard in the power system, and the conduit had given way at the weakest junction rather than letting the spike travel through the whole network. I ran my hand along the intact conduit beside the rupture. The wall was warm. Not residual heat from re-entry, not ambient temperature. Warm the way a machine is warm when something inside it is still running. Low, quiet, but running. I stood still for a long time. The government team had declared this ship dead. The ship's own system had declared this ship condemned. 9 days of specialists had looked at it and walked away. But something in it was still on. I thought about that semi on I-15. The way the driver had walked out of the cab, shaken and pale, certain it was finished. The way I had found the secondary fuel pump still cycling because nobody had thought to check it. The way I had started there, with that one small thing that refused to quit, and worked outward from it until the whole engine ran again. I put my hand flat on the warm wall. I did not feel wonder. I am not built for wonder. I felt the thing I always feel when I find the part that's still trying. I felt like I was already at work. I went back to the ladder. Craig was standing at the base of it looking up. "Well," he said. "She's not dead," I said. "She's just in bad shape." He looked at me the way people look at me when they're not sure if I'm confident or delusional. I had heard that look my whole life. "How long?" he said. I thought about the ruptured conduits, the blown exhaust ports, the dead power cells I had not yet found but knew were there, the central system that had called itself condemned and then kept a small part of itself running anyway, quiet, in the dark, waiting. "Depends on what I find," I said. I climbed back up the ladder. I went back inside. I did not come out until the sun was down, and the desert had gone cold, and Craig had given up standing at the base of the ladder and gone back to his tent. I sat on the floor of the ship in the dark with my flashlight and my notebook, and I started writing down everything that was broken. It was a long list. I was already looking forward to crossing things off. The first week was inventory. I moved through the ship with my flashlight and my notebook, and I cataloged every system I could identify and every failure I could trace. I am not a fast reader of alien engineering. Nobody is, but I am a very patient one. The power cells were dead. All 16 of them, arranged in a ring around the central column, each one drained to zero. Not damaged, drained. Something had pulled every last unit of stored energy out of them in a single draw. The power spike that ruptured the conduits had not been a malfunction. It had been a deliberate attempt to restart something that refused to restart. The ship had tried to jumpstart itself and blown its own fuses doing it. I wrote 16 dead cells, cause discharge event, possible restart, external power source. The propulsion system was more complicated. The main drive, whatever it ran on, was sealed in a casing I could not open without understanding what I was unsealing. I left it alone. The maneuvering thrusters were a different matter. 3 of the 8 were physically intact. The other 5 had various levels of damage from the pressure event. 2 were cracked at the housing. 2 had severed feed lines. 1 had simply been shaken loose from its mounting bracket and was hanging by its connections like a tooth that hadn't finished falling out. I could work with that. The navigation system was dark and silent, and I did not touch it because I did not yet understand what it was connected to. The communications array was physically intact but powered down. The atmospheric systems, the things that presumably kept air breathable inside the hull, were offline but showed no structural damage. They needed power, not repair. The central column was the key. I knew it the way I know a problem in a block engine before I opened the hood. The column distributed power from the cells to every system. Fix the cells, restore the column connections, and most of the ship would come back on its own. But the cells were empty, and I did not have alien power cells. I sat with that problem for 2 days. On the 3rd day, I drove to a salvage yard outside of Las Vegas and stood in the electrical section for 3 hours. I was looking for something with the right output voltage. I had measured the conduit connections with a modified probe I rigged from equipment in the command tent, and I had a number, a specific number. It was not a number that corresponded to any standard Earth electrical component. But it was close to something. It was close to a bank of industrial capacitors off a decommissioned power substation that was sitting in the back corner of the yard under a tarp. I bought all of them. The yard owner looked at me the way Craig looked at me. I was getting used to it. Back at the ship, I spent 4 days building an interface. This is the part that people always want to skip to the end of. They want the moment it worked. They do not want the 4 days of wrong connections and a probe that kept reading error, and one afternoon where I sat on the floor of the ship and ate a sandwich and stared at the ceiling and thought about nothing. The interface had to bridge 2 systems that were never designed to know each other existed. Human capacitor bank running at modified output, alien cell array designed to receive power in a format I could only approximate. I could not make it exact. I could make it close enough. Close enough is a philosophy, not an engineering standard. Every institution I had ever dealt with had told me that. NASA, when they showed me the door, had used the phrase insufficient precision 3 times in the exit interview. I had nodded and driven back to Detroit and fixed a car that a dealer had written off as totaled. Close enough gets the car to move. You fix the precision later. I connected the capacitor bank on a Tuesday morning with Craig watching from the access panel, and 2 government observers he had brought in standing behind him, all 3 of them wearing expressions that suggested they were prepared to be disappointed. I threw the connection. 3 of the 16 cells accepted the charge. Not all of them, 3. Craig started to say something. "Give it a minute," I said. The 3 charged cells fed back into the central column. The column lit up, not fully. A low pulse, slow, like a heartbeat finding its rhythm after a long time without one. But it moved through the column and hit the other cells, and 2 more of them woke up. Then 1 more. 7 of 16, enough. The atmospheric system came on first. A low hum, then a faint circulation of air that had been still for however long this ship had been sitting in the desert. The workstation surfaces along the walls glowed a faint amber, not active, just alive. One of the government observers said something quietly. I did not catch it. I was watching the central column. The ship's onboard system, the same one that had declared itself condemned, came back online. Text appeared on the nearest workstation surface. Not English. A script I had never seen, angular and precise, scrolling in lines I could not read. Then it stopped. Then slowly, one line appeared that was different from the rest. I did not know the language, but I knew what it was doing. It was a diagnostic. It was the ship asking itself what was wrong. I pulled out my notebook. I wrote, Day 14. Ship is asking the right questions. That felt like progress. Over the next 3 weeks, I worked through the maneuvering thruster system. The loose one I remounted with a bracket I fabricated from steel stock I bought at a hardware store in Henderson. The severed feed lines I spliced using a technique I had developed for hydraulic lines on heavy equipment, using a compression fitting that was technically the wrong size, but which I modified on a lathe I borrowed from a machine shop whose owner owed me a favor. The two cracked housings were the hardest problem. The material was not metal, not exactly. It had the density of titanium alloy but a surface behavior closer to ceramic. It did not respond to welding. I spent a week on that. The solution came from thinking about it wrong. I stopped thinking about the crack as a thing to fill and started thinking about it as a thing to reinforce. I could not weld the material, but I could sleeve it. I machined a steel sleeve designed to clamp around the housing and distribute the load away from the crack line. Not a repair, a workaround. The crack would still be there, but it would not be load-bearing anymore. I tested it under pressure in the shop before I installed it. It held. Craig came to watch me install the second sleeve on a Thursday afternoon. He stood at the base of the ladder without saying anything for a while. The team from Nevada filed an updated report, he said finally. What did they say? They said you were making modifications to an alien spacecraft using hardware store components, and that this was likely to cause a catastrophic systems failure. They are not wrong that I am using hardware store components, I said. I tightened the clamp fitting on the sleeve. What does Washington say? Washington says to let you continue, provisionally. How long have I got? He checked his clipboard. They want a status report in 30 days. Tell them 60. He was quiet again. Do you know what you're doing? He said, not combative, genuinely asking. I looked at the sleeve. I looked at the repaired feed lines. I looked at the loose thruster now mounted solid on its bracket. I looked at the central column poolsing at the end of the corridor with 7 of its 16 cells running and the diagnostic system on the workstation screen still scrolling, still cataloging, still asking questions. I know what's broken, I said. That's usually enough. I climbed back down the ladder. I picked up my notebook. I crossed 3 items off the list. The list was still long, but it was shorter than it had been. That is all progress is in the end. A list that gets shorter. A ship that calls itself condemned and then keeps one small light running in the dark, waiting for someone stubborn enough to notice it. I noticed it. I kept working. The communications array came back online on a Wednesday morning, which felt appropriate. Wednesdays have always had that energy, the middle of things, the part where you are too far in to quit and not yet close enough to the end to feel good about it. It is an honest day. The array coming back on a Wednesday felt honest. I had not planned to get the communications system running yet. The propulsion work was the priority, and I was midway through figuring out the atmospheric pressure regulators on the crew compartment, which had turned out to involve a refrigerator compressor in a way I will describe without apology. The array had simply come back on when enough of the power distribution network was restored. It was one of those systems that needed power more than it needed repair. The sound it made was not dramatic, a low tone held for 3 seconds, then silence. Then the workstation nearest the array lit up with a pattern I had started to recognize as the ship's way of saying something has changed. I sat down at the workstation. I had been sitting at these workstations for weeks, and I still could not read the language, but I had started to recognize structures. The way certain symbol clusters appeared at the start of new system activations. The way error states looked different from normal operational output. The way the diagnostic text had a rhythm to it that, once you stopped trying to decode it word by word and started reading it the way you read a waveform, started to say something. What the array workstation was telling me, in a pattern I was 70% sure I was reading correctly, was that it had broadcast a signal. Automatically on startup, a default ping. I sat with that for a moment. Then I went back to the pressure regulator. If someone had received the signal, they would either respond or they would not. I could not control that. I could control whether the atmospheric system would hold pressure when I eventually needed it to, and right now the answer was no, because the regulator that balanced internal and external pressure had a valve assembly that had warped under the heat stress of reentry. The warped valve was why the refrigerator compressor was involved. I want to be clear that I am not proud of this solution in the aesthetic sense. I am proud of it in the functional sense, which is the only sense that matters on a deadline. The valve assembly needed to maintain a specific pressure differential. The warped valve could no longer do that precisely, but a refrigerator compressor running at modified speed could maintain that differential continuously, compensating for the imprecision of the valve in real time instead of relying on a static mechanical seal. It was not elegant. It was not what the ship was designed for. It worked. Craig came out on Friday and looked at the compressor where it sat, connected to the ship's atmospheric system via a bracketed interface I had built over 2 days, humming steadily. "Is that a refrigerator compressor?" he said. "It is. Mounted to an alien spacecraft." "Correct." He looked at it for a long time. "Does it work?" "Atmospheric pressure in the crew compartment is holding at the target differential. Has been for 3 days." He wrote something on his clipboard. I did not ask what. 11 days after the array powered on, the response came. I heard it before I understood what it was. A signal, received by the array, translated by a system that was doing something I had not asked it to do. The ship was running a translation process. It had been running it quietly since the array came back online, pulling from the signal content, building a working model. The workstation lit up with new text. Not the angular alien script, something assembled, approximate, built from pieces. It said this vessel was condemned. How is this vessel transmitting? I read it twice. I pulled my stool over to the workstation and sat down. I had thought, in the loose way you think about things while your hands are doing something else, about what I would say if this happened. I had thought about it the way you think about what you would do if you won enough money to stop working. Not seriously, just the pleasant shape of a hypothetical. The hypothetical was now a workstation screen waiting for an answer. I typed on the interface surface, which had taken me 2 weeks to figure out how to use as an input device, and which still felt like trying to type with oven mitts. I wrote the lid was on too tight, needed a different wrench. The response took 4 minutes. "Who are you?" I thought about that. I wrote, "The person who fixed your ship." 7 minutes this time. "You are not in our assessment of this world." I looked around the ship, the central column running at 11 of 16 cells now, the maneuvering thrusters mounted and sealed and waiting, the atmospheric system holding pressure, the refrigerator compressor humming, the spliced feed lines and the machine sleeves and the capacitor bank that had started all of it. I wrote, "We do not come up much in assessments." The next response took 22 minutes. I used the time to check the compressor pressure readings and eat a sandwich. When it came, it was longer than the others. The translation was rougher, like the system was working harder to carry something more complex across the gap. It said, "Describe what you did to this vessel, specifically, beginning from how you entered." So I did. I started with the jar lid and the torque wrench. I went through the capacitor bank and the interface I had built, and the 3 cells that had taken charge first and the 7 that had followed. I described the thruster bracket I had fabricated, and the compression fittings on the feed lines and the steel sleeves on the cracked housings, and the refrigerator compressor that was currently keeping the crew compartment breathable. I described it the way I describe a repair to a customer. What was broken, what I used, what it does now. It took me 40 minutes to type it all out. My hands hurt. The response when it came was a single line. You repaired this vessel with components from your own world. Yes, I typed. Components not designed for this vessel. Yes. Components with tolerances far below the design specifications of this vessel. Also, yes, I typed, but the compressor is holding. Long pause, longer than the others. Then we are sending someone. I sat back on my stool. I looked at the workstation. I looked at the ship around me. I looked at the column and the thrusters and the compressor and the spliced lines, and all the pieces of this world I had threaded into the bones of something that had come from somewhere I had no name for. I wrote how many? 3, it said. I wrote, I will need more coffee. There was no response to that. I had not expected one. I went to find Craig. He was in the command tent with 2 new government observers who had arrived that week, both of them with the careful stillness of people who were trying to look like they were not nervous. We have incoming, I said. Craig put down his coffee. Define incoming. The people who built the ship, 3 of them, they are coming here. The tent was very quiet. When Craig said, they did not specify. One of the observers stood up. We need to contact Washington. You should do that, I said. I poured myself a cup of coffee from the pot on the folding table. I am going to go check the compressor pressure. I walked back to the ship. I stood in the corridor for a while with my coffee and my flashlight, and I thought about what comes after you fix something. Usually it goes back to whoever it belongs to, and you get paid and you find the next broken thing. That was the shape of my life. Fix it. Hand it back. Move on. I did not know what the shape of this was going to be. The compressor hummed. The column pulsed. The ship held its pressure and its warmth and its small, persistent aliveness. I went back to work. There were still things on the list. There will always be things on the list. The trick is to keep crossing them off and not think too hard about what happens when the list runs out. 11 days later, I found out. They did not arrive in a ship. I want to be accurate about this. They arrived in something that I do not have a word for, because it did not do what ships do. It did not land. It did not fly. It moved from one position in the sky to a position on the ground in a way that my eyes tracked but my understanding did not. The way you can see a card trick happen and still not understand how the card moved. One moment, the alkali flat was empty. The next moment, there were 3 figures standing on it. Craig was beside me. Behind us, a line of government vehicles and a small number of people who had arrived in the previous 48 hours looking important and carrying folders. Washington had mobilized fast once it became clear that the response to my transmissions was not hypothetical. The 3 figures were tall. Not dramatically tall, not the kind of tall that goes into mythology, but enough taller than a person that you noticed it before you noticed anything else. They wore something that was not quite a suit and not quite armor, a close-fitted material that caught the light in a way that moved slightly even when they did not. 2 of them held objects I could not identify. The third held nothing. The third one walked toward us. The government people started moving. Formations. Protocol. A man named Arthur Webb from the State Department stepped forward with the expression of someone who had spent 30 years waiting for this exact moment. The third figure walked past Arthur Webb. It stopped in front of me. I had not expected that. It looked at me with eyes that were shaped differently from mine, set differently in a face that was not constructed on the same geometry as a human face, and it said something in its own language. Then the ship, which I had apparently left a translation process running on, broadcast a response through a small speaker array I had installed near the access panel. What the ship said, in its rough assembled English, was, This is the one who repaired the vessel." The figure looked at me for a moment longer. Then it turned and walked toward the ship. I looked at Arthur Webb. He looked at me. "I guess we're going inside," I said. I followed. The other two figures were already at the access panel. One of them opened it, not with a wrench, with a gesture I could not entirely follow, but the principle was the same. The jar lid opened. Inside, the three of them moved through the ship the way you move through a room you built yourself. Certain, without hesitation. Two of them went directly to systems I had repaired and crouched over them with a focused attention that I recognized as professional. The third, the one who had walked to me on the flat, moved to the central column and placed both hands on it. I stood back and let them look. The first one reached the thruster bracket I had fabricated from steel stock. It examined the bracket. It examined the mounting. It ran a finger along the weld line. Then it turned to the second one and said something. The second one came over, looked at the bracket, said something back. I did not need the translation to understand the tone. It was the tone of two engineers looking at a field repair made under constraint, balancing between impressed and horrified. The second one moved to the spliced feed lines, stopped, looked at the compression fittings, said something that was 3 syllables, the same 3 syllables twice. That one I asked the ship to translate. The ship rendered it as, "This should not work." And yet, I said. The ship translated that too. I do not know how it rendered it in their language, but both engineers looked at me. The third one, still at the column, said something longer. The ship translated. "The power distribution network has been modified at 17 connection points. The cell array is running at 11 of 16 capacity. The atmospheric regulation is being maintained by an external mechanical device." "The compressor," I said. The third one looked at me. The ship translated what it said next as, "Explain the compressor." So I did. I walked them through it. The warped valve, the pressure differential, the decision to compensate continuously rather than repair the static seal. I showed them the interface I had built. I showed them the pressure readings, 3 days of consistent data on a chart I had been keeping in my notebook. The third one, who I was beginning to think of as the lead, studied the notebook page for a long time. Then it said something and the ship translated it as, "You kept records." "Always," I said. It said something else. The ship translated, "The crew of this vessel did not keep records of the failure sequence. We do not know precisely what happened." I pulled out a different page of the notebook. The one from the first week, the inventory, the failure map I had built from the physical evidence. Ruptured conduits, blown exhaust ports, the discharge event that had drained the cells, the chain reaction down through every system. I handed it over. The lead figure held the notebook page and was very still. Then it walked to the workstation where I had been communicating. It typed something on the input surface with a speed that made my 2 weeks of learning to use it feel like a significant personal failure. The workstation displayed a response, not to me, to the other two. Both of them stopped what they were doing. Long conversation. I stood in my ship, the one I had bled for and argued over and argued with and spent weeks inside like it was a second home, and I watched 3 beings from somewhere I had no name for talk about something I could not hear. The lead turned back to me. The ship translated its next words carefully, slower than the others, like the system was working to get it right. It said, "We brought replacement components. We intended to restore the vessel to original specification." "Okay," I said. It said, "We would like to begin." "Okay," I said again. They began the next morning. They had supplies in whatever they had arrived in, precision-manufactured components that were the correct versions of everything I had approximate versioned into working. The correct cell units for the array. The correct valve assembly for the atmospheric regulator. The correct housing material for the cracked thruster casings. Everything I had worked around, they had the right answer to. I stood back and watched and did not interfere. On the second day, one of the engineers, The one who had said this should not work at my thruster bracket began removing the bracket and replacing it with a component from their supply. The thruster fell out of alignment immediately. Not far, a fraction, but the alignment sensor on the workstation showed it clearly. The engineer made an adjustment. The alignment got worse. It made another adjustment, worse still. I watched this for about 4 minutes. "May I said. The engineer looked at me. It stepped back. I looked at the thruster mounting. I looked at the bracket I had fabricated. I looked at the replacement component. The replacement was correct to specification. It was also correct to a specification built around a mounting point that had shifted microscopically during the impact of landing. The original specification was for a hull that had not hit the ground. My bracket had been built to fit the hull as it actually was, not as it had been designed to be. I showed this to the engineer with the measuring tool I used, pointing to the deviation, showing the number. The engineer was still for a moment. Then it said one thing. The ship translated it as, "The hull deformed." "Yes," I said, "it deformed, so I built to what was there." The engineer looked at the replacement component, looked at my bracket, looked at the workstation alignment reading. It put the replacement component down. It picked up my bracket. The alignment reading centered. That was the moment, not a loud one, not a dramatic one. The moment the alignment reading centered and the engineer held my fabricated bracket in its hands and was very quiet. The lead from across the ship had been watching. It walked over. It looked at the bracket. It looked at the alignment reading. It said something to the engineer. The engineer responded, short exchange. The lead turned to me. The ship translated what it said as, "The vessel adapted to you. Your modifications became structural." "Tends to happen," I said, "when you've been in something long enough." The lead looked at me with the eyes I had been trying to read for 2 days. It said, "We need to understand what you did, all of it, completely." I picked up the notebook, the original one, the one with every page of inventory and failure mapping and solution attempts, and crossed out dead ends from the first 11 weeks. I handed it over. "Start from the beginning," I said. Arthur Webb had a prepared statement. He had prepared it over 6 weeks, with a team that included 3 linguists, 2 theoretical physicists, a cultural anthropologist, and someone from an office he would only refer to as the relevant committee. It was 14 pages long. It covered first contact protocols, resource exchange frameworks, mutual non-aggression principles, and something he described as a preliminary framework for ongoing diplomatic engagement. He had practiced delivering it. I had heard him in the command tent, 2 nights before the formal meeting, going through it with the careful rhythm of a man who understood that certain moments only happen once. The formal meeting was in the main compartment of the ship. The government people sat on one side of the central column. The 3 figures sat on the other side. The ship's translation system ran through a speaker array I had upgraded the previous week. Arthur stood up and delivered his statement. It took 31 minutes. When he finished, the lead figure was quiet for a moment. Then it spoke. The ship translated. It said, "We understand. We will consider the frameworks." Then it turned to me. It said, "We have a question for the one who repaired the vessel." Arthur sat down slowly. I said, "Go ahead." The lead said, "In your work here, you made decisions without authorization. You modified systems without understanding them fully. You used components that were not designed for this purpose, and the vessel functions. How do you account for this?" I thought about that for a moment. "I account for it the same way I account for any repair," I said. You find the thing that's broken. You figure out what it needs to do. You find the closest thing you have to the right answer and you make it fit. Then you watch it. If it holds, it holds. If it doesn't, you find a better way. The lead looked at me, long pause. It said, "This is not how engineering works." "It is how field engineering works," I said. "When you do not have the right tool and the job still needs doing." The lead conferred quietly with the other 2. Then it said, "We have decided to compensate your world. We are prepared to offer technology, materials, knowledge, medical systems, propulsion concepts. We will negotiate specifics with your representatives." Arthur reopened his folder. The lead continued, "We also have a separate question for you specifically." I looked at it. It said, "In our civilization, the person who repairs a vessel that others condemned does not return to the ground. That person goes on the vessel." The command tent was very quiet. I said, "That is not the situation here. This is not my ship." It said, "You made it function. That is not an ownership claim. It is an observation. The vessel knows your modifications. Your systems are part of it now. We cannot fully separate what you built from what we built. This is a relevant fact." I did not say anything. It said, "We need someone who thinks as you think, not an expert in what is known, someone who works with what is available. We travel into situations where what is available is not what was planned. We have engineers. We do not have what you are." I looked at the notebook in my hands, the one they had studied for 3 days. Every page of wrong turns and recalculations and crossed out lines and solutions built from the wrong materials. I thought about the shop in Henderson. I thought about the NASA exit interview and the phrase "insufficient precision" delivered by a man who had never fixed anything in his life. I thought about the semi on I-15 and the aircraft engine and every machine I had ever brought back from where other people had left it. I said, "I washed out from the program that should have put me where you are talking about. I was told in writing that I was not the right fit." The lead looked at me. It said, "We condemned this vessel. In our records it is still condemned. It is transmitting from a condemned status. Your program's record of you and our record of this vessel have the same value." I sat with that for a long moment. Outside, through the access panel, the alkali flat stretched out in the late afternoon light, white and flat and enormous. I had driven through it 3 years ago on a job and thought it looked like the surface of somewhere else. "You would need a mechanic," I said, "out there." It said, "We have discovered that we need one, yes." I looked at the ship around me, the column, the thrusters, the compressor still humming away, the spliced lines and the machine sleeves and the capacitor bank that had started it, everything I had built into the bones of something that was never designed to know I existed. I said, "I need one bag in my truck battery in about an hour." It said, "We will wait." I stood up. Arthur Webb looked at me. He looked like a man watching a door close on something that had just opened. I understood. I was the door. "You handled the 14 pages beautifully," I said. He nodded once. I climbed down the ladder for what I was counting as the last time. The truck was parked 50 feet from the ship. I had one duffel bag in the cab that I had never fully unpacked from the drive out here, which turned out to be convenient. I added the notebook. I added the torque wrench from the toolbox in the bed, the long one, the one from Detroit, the one that had opened the jar lid. I looked at the toolbox for a moment. I took 3 more things. I walked back to the ship. The lead was at the top of the ladder, waiting. I climbed up. At the threshold, I turned around and looked at the alkali flat one more time. The command tent, the government vehicles, Craig standing next to his car with his clipboard, not writing anything. Arthur Webb had come out and was standing with his folder under his arm, looking up. It was still light. The sky was the color it goes in Nevada in the late afternoon, that particular shade between blue and something there is no word for, the kind of color that only exists out here and nowhere else. I turned back around. I went inside. The panel swung shut behind me. The ship had 3 cells still offline in the array, a pressure regulator held together by a compressor from a hardware store in Henderson, 17 connection points that had been modified by someone who had no business modifying them, and a notebook full of crossed-out lines and wrong answers, and the solutions that had come after them. It was ready. I was ready. The notebook's last written page had one line on it. I had written it weeks ago and crossed it out and never told anyone what it said. I uncrossed it now, running my pen once across the single line of black ink. It said, "The difference between condemned and fixable is usually just whoever is standing in front of it." I closed the notebook. The column pulsed. "We left."